Hey everybody, welcome to a Contest Prep University feature. We have a special guest with us. We have Kevin Brunacini, a doctor of nursing practice and professor, bringing in the heavy guns when we're going to be talking about research, as well as registered dietitian Austin Kiergaard, who you guys all know. Uh, and this is a little bit of a theme for this particular month. We did a Nutrition Coaching Global Mastermind, matter of fact, two in a row, on discerning research myth versus truth, looking at how to communicate science. And I remember when I was in physical therapy school, and this was my first brush of really any deep academia. And this was in the early 90s. Everything had to be evidence-based, evidence-based, evidence-based. That was like the mantra of the entire healthcare and medical community. And 30 years later, that's still all I hear, but it has lost its power. It has become so cliche. Uh, Out of all of the coaches I mentor and help build their businesses with them, build their brands, the single most used word that they want in the name of their companies and or their taglines is the word science. Everybody wants to attach science to everything. And as somebody who has done four master's theses and two doctoral dissertations, I'm not a research scientist. I still have to cross my T's and dot my I's when I'm even trying to consume appropriate research, when I'm trying to consume it appropriately. And it really gets under my skin, guys, when I see coaches out there or just consumers, competitors who read the title of a headline, the title of a study, and they all of a sudden think they're experts on that particular topic. So I want to spend some time today talking about how we can consume research as competitors and what we need to maybe demand of our coaches if they are portraying themselves as practitioners of a certain methodology, and they're asking us to do things, quote, based on science. So let me start with you, Kevin, first. Because again, you're a professor, you deal with this kind of stuff all the time with students, you're helping people with graduate projects. There are all kinds of ways to categorize science: qualitative, quantitative, experimental, mechanistic, longitudinal. We could just go on and on. You can look up ad nauseum ways to categorize it. And yet, a lot of the things that come about in our industry, the things that are bantered about, tend to be more quantitative. We want to test this. So, what's the best way to get this result? Or if we use this supplement or we use this exercise technique, what happens? When you yourself look at health science research, where do you tend to go first? Just for your general knowledge, what journals, what news feeds, how do you stay up to date?
Mm. I won't lie, I'll say a lot of it comes through what's shared with social media and just other clinicians, whether they're primary care, family medicine, and or certainly nutrition. In this context, it's nutrition, but I have my feet in both camps and they obviously bleed or spill over into one another at times. But that's a big one, and whatever I can get access to, then I'll save those references. And I got ref works of hundreds of articles just in Dropbox just for myself, just to reference and update as I go along. I mean, CEUs or stuff I find through professional organizations are one, but frankly, it's really not that maybe current. But it's just, for me, it's free. So, that's at least some resource. Um, Otherwise, it's just random searches. CINAHL, that's a big nursing one, but it's, PubMed, Medline, those are really, and Cochrane report, those are, especially for those that are maybe not big or published yet, but they're in the database. Cochrane's going to get those kind of the alternative ones, if you will, where they're not big yet, but at least there's something that might be some good cross references there. But those are my big four databases. And you find thousands easily in any one of them.
Well, that is a perfect answer because that's where I think we all get the top line information. When I graduated from even my first doctorate, social media didn't exist yet, right? So I subscribed to a lot of journals, the Journal of American or Clinical Nutrition, Journal of Obesity. You could look at Cell, Nature, Science, things like that. Look at the big ones. And I mean, it's kind of weird now, but that's how we used to have to get information. Now, of course, with the click of a mouse, you're literally in Google Scholar or PubMed, and you can search for anything. So I think the average listener is going to do the same thing. Like they only hear of research based on somebody that they're following who says XYZ. That should just be the starting point, though, not the end point. Because Austin, when you, as a registered dietitian, and you have patients in hospitals, you have to have correct information for, you have to have knowledge of. You obviously, as a coach and a director in the diet doc for uh, curriculum, for practices, that we create for clientele, you have to stay up to date with all of this. How much time do you spend even now just looking at something, saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Let me go look up that citation. Let me go see what this study was like. Let me go look at how they created the methodology, see what their results were, their conclusions, etc."
Taking a delay. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. So apologize if you hear that. Guessing somebody walked by the door. So to answer your question, I spend a lot more time than I thought I would, but I mean that in a good way because when you go to school to be a dietitian, and they've kind of changed the curricula a little bit, but it was very research based. We had to take a lot of classes in my undergrad and to spend time on how to read research, all the different types of research, what things are more valid or have more validity to them, excuse me. Um, and so I'm kind of glad that I'm spending more time looking at research because I'm getting to use that information. So I would say right now, at least 5 to 10 hours a week, constantly looking at research, whether it's in the hospital for things for my patients or whether it's things that, like Kevin said, like there might be some popular, nutrition topics out in social media. So I use similar databases like you guys use, and I'll use stuff from, we have the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics body that allows us to look into some other research and whatnot. And so sometimes I'll use that information and I'll dive into, okay, what are their studies that they're citing saying? How recent are they? So I look at a lot of stuff. I also ask a lot of questions with the research, how recent is it? What type of a study it is? I know we might dabble into that a little bit, but I spend, a good amount of my week, especially for the things that we do with the diet intelligence, that's, not factoring those types of things into account, which we spend a good amount of time on. I know the three of us do. So I'm glad that I get to use that knowledge and kind of share it with people.
Yeah, let me go back to the first time I really had to do what I would consider research. It wasn't experimental, but at the IU School of Medicine, I'm finishing my doctorate in nutrition, and for the parameters that I set for my topic, I had printed, I mean, from a tractor fed printer at the med school library, more than 3,000 studies. So that's just how many I had to sort through. And I had a time window. So like you just said, I decided, okay, for my qualifications for this particular position paper, meta-analysis, research review, I'm going to look at the last 10 years. So here is my topic, 3,000 studies that I then had to sift through, read, analyze, see if they fit the criteria that I was going to use, and then whittle it down to what my citation list ended up being, which is under 300. And that's just on one topic. And when we look at something like, hey, how much volume should you have for your legs? How many sets a week? Or what about frequency? What about intensity and load? What about protein synthesis? What about does this supplement work? Does that supplement work? Every single question we can ask, or everything that we read through influencers online, that is the tip of the iceberg. As I said, that should be your starting point to just ask the question. is what this person is purporting even true? Is it relevant? Does even this one study that they're citing have any validity whatsoever? Then you have to understand there's probably a mountain of research behind that. And probably some controversy, probably somebody who agree and some people who disagree, some studies who prove one thing and some that may, quote, prove another. And for anybody to say, I have exhaustively gone through all of that research, analyzed it, and I understand it to the nth degree, meaning every single one of those studies that have perhaps dozens of graduate students and researchers and doctors doing the studies, I now, in that entire compilation and synthesis of all information, I know more than they all do. Therefore, here's my dogmatic decision and position. I mean, that is so ridiculous to even think we can look on social media and read somebody's post and then say, okay, that proves it to me. That's all I need to know. So if we do anything today, I want to obviously create an air of skepticism. I want everybody to walk away saying, yes, I need to consume more research, but I also need to keep my guard up and I need to keep an open mind. So Kevin, do you have any examples of places where you were really surprised or changed your mind, where you had a certain opinion and then you saw like, wow, I really missed a lot of shit here, and then you did a more exhaustive look and came to a different conclusion?
I want to say no, not at least in recent history. I oh no, with my doctorates, my focus was in quality improvement, which is a facet of evidence-based practice paradigm versus traditional research, which is qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, etc. Complementary of one another, but a different beast in of itself in terms of application, development, etc. So, frankly, I lean on you, Joe, as far as being PhD based on more methodology analysis, etc., because that's not necessarily my forte. Mine's more of the clinical application and blah blah blah. But with that said, um, goodness, this I feel like this is maybe low hanging fruit, but and maybe very just trite, but like the use of glutamine. Like I used to take BCAAs 10 years ago. And based on the consensus with the evidence in the past probably 5, 10 years, especially probably 5, I don't bother at all with it just because it's pretty insignificant as long as protein needs are met throughout the day. And therefore I just don't bother as a supplement need unless I have nothing else to do, then cool. But I guess that's one nutritional related thing that I've changed offhand or off the cuff of my mind. But otherwise,
So that's a great one. Let me actually stop you right there because that is a perfect one. I remember when a single study came out on HMB, and everybody in the world is now taking HMB. And then a single study came out on CLA, and everybody's taking CLA. And the very next subsequent studies just try to reproduce those simple results, failed and failed again and failed again. And then researchers started looking at why it was failing. And then it was like, oh, okay, this is kind of obvious. We should have seen that. But again, I mean, those first 10 years based on consumption of something, based on one study with millions of dollars of marketing hype because supplement companies are now trying to sell this. In what you're saying here, just to catch everybody up, is I mean, they probably all know because, as you said, it's low hanging fruit only because it's been so publicized in the last few years. Obviously, branched chain amino acids make sense. Of all of the amino acids we need, here are the ones that create protein synthesis. And so why not? It's like, that's great. But then research comes out and says, well, if you're actually getting enough protein, there's really no impact. And same with glutamine. It takes 5 to 8 grams just to get through your stomach. And on and on. You keep seeing these qualifiers. It's like, okay. In this situation, maybe at this dose, if this, and finally you're down to saying, okay, is it worth spending 50 or $75 a month to get maybe a fraction of 1% or no result? Like, it's nutritional food. It is amino acid content that you're putting in your body. But if your protein is high enough, when you get out of the mechanistic study, so a mechanistic study shows you ingest branched chain amino acids, you spike protein synthesis. Case closed. You want more protein synthesis as a bodybuilder, so take branched chains. But no, you put it in an actual experimental study, inside the body, go through the morphology and an entire protocol where you're doing muscle biopsies and blood draws and so forth, and you realize, okay, that's actually not translating to lean body mass gain. And so if you didn't have a questioning, skeptical mind in the beginning, you would have said, well, this is, quote, logical. And so now I'm going to believe it. Then a lot of people did. A lot of this goes on in training research as well. But Austin, do you have a particular type of study you like, whether it's, causal, correlational, longitudinal, random controlled trial? Like what's your gold standard? And maybe, because I know this is kind of a trick question, looking for what? They all have value, but what do you like to see in maybe what categories, what research really gets you excited?
I like I like meta-analysis, systematic reviews, randomized control trials. I like things that they've spent a lot of time, they've looked at things, they've tested, and I I like to look at the testing methods as well. Is that really what I'm looking for in the testing method? Was there bias within this study? That's another important factor. I think people need to understand, like, because there's so much research, there's different types of research, as we've kind of all been alluding to and discussing. I'm not the biggest fan, I'll just be honest, of cohort studies. I think that they do have a purpose, though, and I think they have a place. I think when we're talking about nutrition, though, that can be kind of, a concern, meaning, like, we can look and say, well, there was a cohort study that said those that drank diet pop had a similar relationship having diabetes. Well, then somebody hears that and they think, well, if I drink diet pop, I'm going to get diabetes. That's not necessarily what that study is saying. So, but I think that, like a cohort study and having that information, that allows us to take a deeper dive and investigation into that relationship and do a different type of a study, one that we can get more real, factual, direct link. Is this really happening, or is this not really happening? So that's really what I like to try to look for. And so just to give people a nice little piece of advice too, I know you guys have both talked about PubMed. Like, you can actually go into PubMed and you can filter what type of research and the years as well. So, I mean, you can look up, hey, is there a lot of research, at least within PubMed, I'm using as the example here, is there a lot of research on this specific topic with, let's say, nutrition? And is there a lot of research in the meta-analysis, systematic review, randomized control trial within the last 5 to 10 years? And then you can look, and you might see pages and pages of information, or you might see like 3 studies. So that's something that people listening, that they can try to do that as well. And you can kind of just use some common sense. If there's a lot of information, well, there you go. There's your library. There's your reading material for the next month or two. And to your point, Joe, read through that. See how well you can educate yourself.
Yeah, you mentioned, um, you saying something, or was that my feedback? Sorry.
That might have been your feedback.
You mentioned bias, and I'll give you an example. So a lot of people are quoting this meta-analysis on artificial sweeteners and saying, hey, look, it even showed that artificial sweeteners may be better than water at losing weight. And they had this whole big thing. Everybody cites this. I picked it apart last month. And first of all, what was quoted in the title was not even what was proven. So it was extremely misleading. And then they disproved with some of the results what they purported. And I started thinking, this is very strange. Like, this is just not adding up. And so I immediately went down to see who actually conducted the study, who funded it, and so forth. And I saw it was some kind of a European science organization. It wasn't listed as a certain research institution, a university. So I looked that up, and I see that particular institution is like we would create in the States as a shell company, like a tax shelter. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. Like, who is funding that particular science organization? Guess who it was? All of the chemical companies who create artificial sweeteners. All of them. That's who funds that particular organization. Now, I'm not saying that there was that it was not a useful meta-analysis. I'm not saying that it was completely awful and should be retracted, but it certainly does not prove what they say they were proving. And just because there is that type of bias, it makes me say, okay, out of all of the rest of the research, I have to put that on that shelf of being extremely worthy of skepticism. And now let's look at some of these other things, which may be epidemiological studies, longitudinal studies, some randomized control studies, some with different parameters that they're looking at. I mean, there's so much when you look at every study where you have to say, okay, this shows me this, but it doesn't answer these other 100 questions. It only proves this one thing. And you have to, like a puzzle, put all of that together. And that's what makes a field expert or a subject matter expert an expert. This is what they do. They've done it for decades. They know every study that's ever been conducted. They've already analyzed them and picked them apart. So us, as consumers of that research, again, you have to go in with the utmost humility and say, okay, I'm going to learn something, but I don't know if it's going to change my world. I don't know if I can, even if it's exciting and it's very confirming with my own current biases, I can't just let it pad that and walk away. If it's something I really care about, I need to keep looking. Go ahead.
I was just saying, I think to add to that, I think the other important thing that people need to realize is even though I'm talking about these types of studies, you have to look with any study, as you did, you have to investigate. Well, this doesn't make sense. Like, I thought this is what they were saying. Who funded this or where this is coming from? And some people are going to hear that and say, that just sounds too time consuming. Well, if that's the case, then you've kind of answered what you're doing. You're reading the subtitle thing. So just be cautious in the information you spread moving forward. But I think it's just important to note that, you said it best, like the people that are putting out this research, like this is their area. These people that are in research, like they've read the studies, they're trying to improve, they're trying to find things to become better. And so, I mean, it takes a lot for us consumers to just want to focus on one study. Or since we're talking about biases, people need to also make sure that they're looking at both sides to what they're looking for. So my point is like, we can look at research and we can naturally be like, well, I want to find research that feeds my bias, that tells me I'm right. Okay, but is there research in that same field that also tells you you're wrong? And how much research is on both sides? Is there more research that's starting to shift to you being wrong or you being right? And, you have to make sure you don't do that because a lot of people I know feed into that where they're like, no, this has got to be right. This has got to be right. I know this is right. And it's like, but did you find 2 studies that said you're right and 10 that said you were wrong? You have to really, like you said, have some humility when you're looking at this stuff.
And then even looking further at, was this peer reviewed? Was it published in a reputable journal, meaning it underwent a lot of good scrutiny? That's why journals are ranked and so forth in terms of prestige among academics. But the other thing you have to do is watch that you're just not picking your heroes and saying, okay, this person seems like a really nice person and they seem honest. I'm gonna just kind of jump on their bandwagon. Because even they have incentive sometimes to be biased, and sometimes they don't even know their own biases. But for example, a recent president of Stanford just had to resign because of falsifying his own data for his own research. A huge department chair at Harvard just did the same thing, just literally got canned for falsifying, data. Nobody's above that. And even if you could give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe they didn't really, really, really intentionally do it, certainly their own biases, because maybe that's how they've built their career. Maybe they've already published 10 studies. Maybe they've got 2 best-selling books. How many people are going to say, holy shit, wow, everything I've done up to this point in my career was wrong. Now this new research proves that all of that was in error. It's really tough to do that. And that's what gets even some of these academics and scientists behind the 8 ball. But Kevin, let me give you an example. We'll do a little role playing here. And I know this can't be perfect because we can't create just a massive amount of data. But let's say you have a graduate student who said, Dr. Brunacini, I've got this study. I'm doing it on this exercise versus this exercise. And so I'm going to prove this semester for my graduate thesis that this particular exercise is better than this one. And I did a 6-week study, and I had 17 students, students on campus. And here's what we did. What would you tell them? Obviously, I'm not giving you all the data and all that, but what would you tell them? Like, oh, hang on a second. Like, here's what we have to do to make this study as valid as possible. And maybe we have to change some of those parameters, or we have to limit what we can even say we're trying to assess. But when somebody comes to you with even a research idea, how do you start shaping that with them?
Keep in mind, like I said earlier, with my background, when it's traditional research, I don't have a clue because that's not my background. I wasn't educated in that, but there might be some schools that are pseudo PhD based, but that's another topic. Um, but nonetheless, helping students develop a project, EBP or traditional research, obviously starts with literature review. What are those gaps? What are you trying to identify? What's the premise, evaluate, measure, et cetera, et cetera? What is your problem that you want to deal with? And what's the literature say with support against it, et cetera? And in EBP land, with what I'm taught in, it's from clinical application, it's a matter of relevancy. Is this a change that is necessary for the clinical practice or for the patient population? If so, great. What's the volume therefore as the next step? Because I saw this a lot with students. They are passionate about a topic, whatever it might be, but it only happens 1% of the time. It's noble, but you're not going to get volume, not going to get a sufficient volume to test this or measure this change you're wanting to do and get meaningful data out of it. So that's usually the first step that as an advisor was to help them to understand and ignore passion for a minute. What is the clinical problem? Assuming that the clinical practice wants to do something about it. And then next step is there volume to even defend this problem that they're wanting to do or change they're wanting to implement? And assuming there isn't, then opens the floodgates for more questions and more annoyance to them. But that's really the first thing, and it's a matter of context. What's the problem? What are you wanting to achieve? And practicality of meeting that.
Exactly. And it's excellent. I'm glad you started with the fact that, look for the problem first in the setup of the research, because as a consumer of research, that should be one of the first things we consider also. What was their incentive for doing this? Was there a valid concern, a gap in the literature, a gap in understanding? Otherwise, it can just be incentivized monetarily or agenda driven and so forth. But one of the things, and I know you don't do exercise science, personally for research. But one of the reasons I picked that particular example is that's the kind of stuff that gets floated around our industry a lot. And I want to show you some of the embedded biases and problems, because when we are picking, as you said, a personal passion, we may have some biases that we don't even know. Like, we just want something so badly to be true. I went into one of my research projects with that in mind. Like, this is what I'm going to prove. And the research showed the exact opposite. And I had to kind of do that. I had to go in and say, okay, wow, I just literally created research and proved everything that I believed was wrong. And that was a big turning point for me. It was actually on protein synthesis and protein need, my first master's degree. But in this particular arena of exercise science, most of the time the subjects are young students. So, that's one particular subject bias that could be a problem. Is this applicable to me in my mid 50s? These are young people who are primarily uninjured. They only have a couple years of training. Does this transfer over to people who've been training for 30 years? Is this a 6 or a 12-week study? Can you really extrapolate what it means if you're going to do it for 6 months or a year? These are the kind of things that you have to note in a study to say, okay, what am I really learning here? What were the limitations of this study? I'm going to go around as just a little bit of a roundtable to finish. I'll start with you, Austin, and then Kevin, and then I'll wrap up. What is the one thing that you would tell our viewers and listeners that is just critical for you to approach from even just a competitor mindset? I'm novice. I'm not a researcher. I don't have a research-based degree, but dang it, I want to have the most muscle I can. I want to be the leanest. I want to do the best for my health. I want all these things. Who do I trust? Who do I believe? How do I really make sure I'm applying this information properly? Give me a point or two that you think, Austin, that is just imperative on how people consume and apply research.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand. So you're asking like what advice I would give to someone that's just starting to consume research? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
All the people looking online right now, Instagram, trying to create their workouts and nutrition plans.
I'm sure you get tired of me here. I'm gonna take a step back because I think it's important. I think people need to actually look at like what goes into a study, like actually understand some research terminology and how research is conducted start to finish. Then the reason I say that is because when you can understand that what the abstract is and what the discussion is and what the results, how the studies are put together, then when you actually start looking at studies, you can be like, okay, at least I understand how these are flowing and what some of this information means because I just I think people they see big research articles and they're like, well, I'm just going to either read the abstract or skip them all the way down to the conclusion because I don't know what any of this stuff means. I think I've even heard Brett Contreras say, if you want to fall asleep, just go read some research. You'll fall asleep right away. There's just some stuff that's not sexy in there. So at least if you can understand some of the terminology and how research is conducted and how some studies are different, and there's a lot. I mean, if you're a visual learner, there's a lot of great scientists out there that have YouTube videos that can kind of teach you some of this terminology. Okay, now there's my step back. Now let's move forward to the actual part of the question. Now that you've got some basic knowledge in that, now go look up the reputable sources that we've talked about, look up things through high level research reviews. And there's some names and we can talk about that another time. People that are putting out good research. And when I say putting out good research, they're not afraid to say, well, what we thought we were going to find, we didn't find it. So, you sometimes don't hear that on social media platforms when people are trying to post studies because, like you said, they may have a slight bias to kind of promoting their own thing. So that's kind of my advice on where to start.
Perfect, perfect. I'm going to come back to that because I agree wholeheartedly. How about you, Kevin?
I already had my notes on this. I figured a question like this would come up. So I already have notes because this is something that whether students ask it in lecture or not, I'm going to make sure that they have this information themselves. So, and it's a three question thing to just kind of ask yourself as a consumer, clinician, whomever. But three questions to ask when evaluating data or research is what's the actual evidence? So that's assuming you've read it. Whether you understand it, that's another thing. But assuming you do, what's the evidence say? Does it actually match or say what occurred? If not, that's kind of a big red flag. If so, cool, move, next step. So you've looked at the data compared to what? What is this, what's kind of going a little bit deeper into what the evidence was and, this change did this compared to what, or the like artificial sweeteners, this is not dangerous or something isn't dangerous. Well, compared to what? What's the context of this thing or something is either safe or not? Because anything could be deadly, dose makes a poison, blah, 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 but compared to what? Thirdly, at what cost? And not necessarily financial, although it can be one, but what's the trade-off for something? So if you want to achieve this, you have to expect there's going to be a trade-off for that. Is that worth it and practical? And that gets into the clinical significance versus statistical significance concepts of when evaluating data, because you can have statistical significance or not. That doesn't make it clinically significant or relevant. to implement a change or to apply. So that goes into more of the weeds, but that's can be just as impactful when evaluating things because it may be perfect, but if it's just that's the difference of mechanistic data, it seems perfect and logical, but when you actually compare it in real life, it doesn't hold up. So what's the deal? We have to evaluate that and understand those limitations and or boundaries of when to apply certain things in the context of generalization. Ooh, I'm pumped.
So everything you guys just said was perfect, and it's still a lot. Like everybody listening to this is going to walk away and say, "Gosh, man, did those guys even really help me?" Like I still don't know if I could read a research paper and come to a conclusion. And that should be your conclusion, that you can't. You have to realize it's this flowing river of research that is still ongoing, and you can look at these chronological hash marks and say, at this point in time, this is what most researchers agree to. These may be the controversial points that they don't. Like you said, Kevin, does it matter? What cost? What trade-off? And just stay away from hard dogmatic conclusions for most things. As a matter of fact, if there is a lot of infighting, like this does this, no, it doesn't, blah, blah, then they're probably so close together that it depends a lot on context. And maybe you could say, well, I don't even know if that matters to me any longer. Whereas some things are very, very dogmatic. We can look at the fact that for protein consumption, for example, at least two protein summits, there may have been a third, where some of the best researchers on the planet assembled and they create their position papers and they hash out all the research together. And after a weekend, they walk away with a stance. And then you look at subsequent research, on that, and it's very confirming that on kind of a bell curve, about 2 times the R day of protein is the sweet spot for assimilation and utilization and all that. You can say, okay, that's just not controversial any longer. Like all of the best experts agree that here you can use that research or not, but it's pretty settled. Now, if you're in stage 3 cancer, or you're a bodybuilder with 40 years of experience, or you're a newbie, like, there are different ways to apply it, but that gets us back into those entanglements. I just want people to walk away being less dogmatic, being more skeptical. And my final point would be just pick the broadest perspective and work your way in. So Austin said systematic reviews, meta-analyses, look at what some of the biggest, most reputable researchers are saying, read all that information, and then maybe sink in one layer at a time into different types of studies. And one of the best points, I'm glad you made, Austin, is you don't have to go take a course on research, but make it a self-study pursuit. Am I learning how to be a better research consumer because of the way I'm pursuing the consumption of research? Am I getting better at it? Am I learning something about how to learn? But let me stop there. We've gone over our education director, Dr. Kevin Brunacini, our dietetics director, Austin Kiergaard. Thank you so much. A big feature in Contest Prep University here. And Austin and I are going to continue with some peak intel episodes in our Contest Prep University, where we really, really dig into and show you how to apply some of this research. So we'll see you guys next time. Appreciate you watching.